The dice stopped rolling the second he saw the child. Kang Ji-yeon's hand froze mid-reach for his whiskey. The Paradise Hotel ballroom continued its elegant chaos around him, crystal clinking, laughter echoing off marble. The Shanghai delegation, waiting for his signature on contracts worth more than small countries. None of it registered. Because Lauren Wilson had just walked through the doors in a dress that caught light like molten gold, and tucked against her side, small fingers wrapped in hers, was a boy who looked exactly like Ji-yeon had at 4 years old. The room tilted. She moved through the crowd with her head high, her natural curls framing her face in a wild halo that made her look untamed and regal all at once. Her brown skin glowed under the chandeliers. But it was the set of her shoulders that struck him. She wasn't nervous anymore. The woman who used to jump at shadows now carved through a room full of predators like she owned the air they breathed. An American executive appeared at her elbow, leaning too close, whispering something that made her smile. Not the soft, private smile Ji-yeon remembered. This one had edges. The boy's hand slipped into his pocket, drew something out. 2 dice. He rolled them over his knuckles with practiced ease. Click-clack, click-clack. Ji-yeon stopped breathing. That sound. He knew that sound the way he knew his own heartbeat. It was the rhythm he'd used to calm himself in the dark. The nervous tic he'd carried from childhood until the night he'd left those dice behind in a clinic that smelled like antiseptic and desperation. He'd thought they were lost, forgotten. But before we go any further, make sure you hit that subscribe button and turn on notifications so you never miss an upload. Trust me, you're going to want to see how this ends. The executive's hand dropped to Lauren's waist. Ji-yeon's vision sharpened to a pinpoint. His lieutenant was saying something about timing, about the contracts, about maintaining composure, but the words dissolved into static. Every instinct he'd honed to survive screamed at him to move, to cross that ballroom floor and remove that hand with whatever force necessary. Mine. Something ancient and possessive growled in his chest. Even though he'd burned that bridge himself, even though he'd made sure she hated him enough to stay away. Except she was here. And she wasn't alone. Lauren bent down, listening as the boy whispered something against her ear. Her hand smoothed over his dark hair with such tenderness that Ji-yeon felt it like a physical wound. She nodded, straightened, and said something to the executive that made him step back immediately. Then she turned, scanning the ballroom with the kind of calculated awareness Ji-yeon recognized because he'd lived it his entire life. Their eyes locked. For 3 seconds, the world held its breath. Lauren's expression didn't change, no shock, no fear, no desperate longing. Just a cool, assessing stare that stripped him bare and found him wanting. She let him drown in it, let him feel every word he'd thrown at her 5 years ago ricochet back, then dismissed him with the slight lift of her chin and looked away. But the boy didn't look away. The child's gaze stayed fixed on Ji-yeon, with an intensity that made his skin prickle. Those eyes, dark and knowing and far too old for a 4-year-old face, held something that looked like recognition. The dice kept rolling. Click-clack, click-clack. Then the boy smiled. Not the innocent smile of a child meeting a stranger. Something else. Something that made Ji-yeon's mouth go dry. The child lifted one small fist, opened it. Inside sat a single die, edges worn smooth from years of use. Ji-yeon's die, the one he'd carried since he was 8 years old, the one that had made impossible decisions bearable. The boy closed his fist, slipped his hand back into Lauren's, let her guide him toward the exit, and Ji-yeon stood frozen in the center of his empire, surrounded by power he no longer wanted, watching the past he'd buried walk away wearing a tiny suit and carrying pieces of his soul in its pocket. How long had she known? What had she told the boy? And why did the child look at him like he'd been waiting his entire life for this moment? To understand how a man like Kang Ji-yeon could be destroyed by a single glance from a 4-year-old, you have to go back to the night he learned that some debts can't be paid in blood. 5 years earlier, when he was still convinced he was too dangerous to need anyone. Pain was just another form of mathematics, and Ji-yeon had always been good with numbers. The shipping container stank of rust and fear. The man zip-tied to the metal chair had stopped screaming an hour ago, which meant he'd either accepted his fate or lost enough blood that his body had prioritized survival over protest. Ji-yeon stood 3 feet away, hands in his pockets, watching his lieutenant work with the clinical detachment of someone observing a chemistry experiment. The traitor had stolen from the wrong people. The numbers didn't lie. $200,000 missing from a shipment meant someone had to pay the equation back in pain. Please, the man wheezed, blood bubbling at the corner of his mouth. I have a daughter. Bad math, Ji-yeon said, his voice flat as winter stone. He checked his watch. The man had been alive for 43 minutes longer than he'd calculated. Inefficient. You stole from men who don't forgive. You knew the cost. His lieutenant looked up, waiting for the signal. Ji-yeon gave a single nod. The gun fired once. The sound echoed off metal walls, and then dissolved into nothing. The man slumped forward, and Ji-yeon felt exactly what he always felt when the math corrected itself. Nothing. He turned toward the container doors, already thinking about the paperwork waiting at his office, the shipment schedules that needed adjusting, the territorial dispute with the Seoul faction that required his attention. His mind was a machine, processing variables and outcomes, finding the most efficient path through every problem. Emotion was a luxury he'd abandoned at 8 years old in an orphanage where crying meant you were weak and weakness meant you didn't eat. The night air hit him as he stepped outside. Rain was falling in sheets, turning the dock into a maze of shadows and reflected light. His car waited 50 feet away, headlights cutting through the downpour. He walked toward it with measured steps, his lieutenant flanking him, 2 bodyguards trailing behind. The shot came from nowhere. 1 second, Ji-yeon was walking. The next, fire exploded through his abdomen and his legs forgot how to hold him. He hit the pavement hard, rain hammering his face, his hand instinctively pressing against the wet heat spreading across his shirt. His lieutenant was screaming something about a sniper, about getting to cover. But Ji-yeon's ears were ringing and his vision was starting to blur at the edges. He'd been shot before, stabbed twice, beaten more times than he could count. But this felt different. This felt like his body was trying to empty itself onto the concrete, and no amount of willpower could stop it. "Boss!" His lieutenant's face appeared above him, rain-soaked and panicked. "Stay with me. We need to move. Hospital," Ji-yeon managed, tasting copper. "We can't. The Seoul faction has people in every emergency room in the city. They're waiting for exactly this. You show up bleeding, and you're dead before you hit the operating table." Ji-yeon's hand was slick with blood. Too much blood. The math was simple and brutal. He had maybe 20 minutes before shock killed him. Maybe 30 if he was lucky. No hospital meant no surgeon. No surgeon meant death by arithmetic. "Then I'm dead," he said, and the words came out calmer than they should have. "No." His lieutenant grabbed his jacket, dragging him toward the car. "There's someone. A doctor. Off the books. She works out of the foreigner district, treats people who can't go to hospitals. They call her the shadow doctor. A back alley butcher. She's American, trained at Johns Hopkins. Got her license revoked in the States for treating gunshot wounds without reporting them. She's good, boss. She's our only shot." Ji-yeon's vision was darkening. Rain pounded against his face, and somewhere in the distance, sirens wailed. He thought about dying here, in the rain, on the docks where he'd killed so many others. There was a certain symmetry to it. The math completing itself. "Drive," he said. They hauled him into the car. Every movement sent fresh agony through his gut, but Ji-yeon kept his jaw locked, refusing to give pain the satisfaction of a sound. His lieutenant barked an address to the driver, and the car lurched forward, tires screaming against wet pavement. Ji-yeon pressed harder against the wound, feeling his pulse hammer against his palm. 60 beats per minute, too slow. His body was shutting down, prioritizing the vital organs, abandoning everything else. The foreigner district blurred past the windows. Neon signs in English and broken Korean, narrow streets crowded with expats and immigrants. The kind of neighborhood where people minded their business because asking questions got you hurt. The car skidded to a stop in an alley behind a laundromat. Through the rain-streaked window, Ji-yeon could see a metal door with a red cross spray-painted on it. "Get her," his lieutenant ordered. 2 men kicked the door open. Ji-yeon heard shouting, a woman's voice sharp with authority, and then they were dragging him out of the car. The rain had slowed to a drizzle, but Ji-yeon barely felt it. His entire world had narrowed to the wound in his gut and the strange lightness creeping through his limbs. Blood loss. Stage 2, maybe 3. They carried him through the door into a space that smelled like bleach and something herbal he couldn't name. Fluorescent lights blazed overhead, making him squint. A metal examination table dominated the center of the room, surrounded by medical equipment that looked too clean, too organized for an illegal clinic. "Put him down and get out," a voice said. Ji-yeon's head lolled to the side. Through the haze of pain, he saw her for the first time. She stood near a steel sink, hands dripping with soap, her dark eyes blazing with an anger that made his men hesitate. She was young, late 20s, maybe with deep brown skin and natural curls pulled back in a hasty bun. She wore scrubs splattered with someone else's blood, and there was a smudge of something dark on her jaw. But it was her posture that struck him. She didn't look afraid. She looked furious. "I said get out," she repeated, her voice carrying the kind of command that made men with guns take orders. "You're contaminating my sterile field." One of his enforcers reached for her arm. Her hand moved faster, cracking across his face with enough force to snap his head sideways. The room went silent. Ji-yeon felt a laugh bubble up in his chest, hysterical and inappropriate, because he was dying and this woman had just slapped one of Busan's most dangerous men like he was a misbehaving child. "Boss?" his lieutenant asked, hand hovering near his weapon. Ji-yeon waved them off, the gesture costing him more energy than it should. Out. They left, boots echoing on concrete, the door slamming behind them. Silence fell, broken only by the hum of fluorescent lights and Ji-yeon's ragged breathing. The woman moved toward him, her steps measured and purposeful. She didn't ask who he was, didn't ask who shot him. She simply pulled on latex gloves and reached for his shirt. "This is going to hurt," she said. Ji-yeon's hand shot out, fingers wrapping around her wrist with the instinct of a man who'd survived by never letting anyone get too close. His grip was weak, trembling, but the threat was clear. She didn't pull away. Instead, she leaned in, bringing her face inches from his, and Ji-yeon saw something in her eyes that made his breath catch. Not fear, not submission, understanding, like she knew exactly what kind of monster was bleeding on her table, and she decided to save him anyway. "Let go," she said quietly, "or you bleed to death. Your choice." For the first time in 20 years, Kang Ji-yeon released his grip and let someone else take control. Lauren didn't waste time celebrating her small victory. She prepped the area, hands steady despite the way her heart was trying to claw out of her chest. The man watched her every movement with an intensity that made her skin prickle. Not the glazed stare of someone in shock, but something sharper, aware, like he was measuring her competence with each gesture, deciding whether she was worth trusting with his life. "This is going to hurt," she warned, reaching for the forceps. "Everything hurts," he said, and there was something in his voice that made her pause. Not self-pity, just fact. Like pain was a language he'd been fluent in since childhood. Lauren found the bullet lodged against his spleen. Extracting it required steady hands and steadier nerves, and she had both. The man didn't make a sound, but she felt him go rigid beneath her touch, every muscle locked in an effort not to thrash. His breathing turned sharp and shallow, and when she glanced at his face, she saw his jaw clenched so tight she thought his teeth might crack. "Breathe," she murmured, and felt the absurdity of the command even as she said it. He did, though. A long, shuddering inhale that made his chest expand beneath her palm. Their eyes met over the blood and instruments, and something passed between them that Lauren couldn't name. Recognition. Maybe. Or the beginning of something far more dangerous than either of them was prepared for. She removed the bullet, dropped it into a metal tray with a satisfying clink, started suturing. The man's eyes never left her face, and Lauren realized with a strange jolt that she didn't mind being watched. Not by him. Not when his gaze felt less like violation and more like reverence, like she was performing a miracle instead of just doing her job. "What's your name?" he asked, voice rough as gravel. Lauren tied off the final stitch before answering. "Dr. Wilson, and you're going to live, so you're welcome." His mouth curved into something that might have been a smile if it wasn't so sharp. Lauren Wilson. I'll remember that. Something about the way he said her name made her hand still, like he was making a promise. Or a threat. Possibly both. 3 weeks later, the storm hit Busan like a fist. Thunder rattled the clinic's windows while rain hammered the roof in sheets. And Lauren was checking Ji-yeon's temperature for the 3rd time that night when his fever spiked to dangerous territory. He'd been recovering well too well, she'd thought, for a man who'd nearly bled out on her table, but infections didn't care about timelines or stubborn pride. She'd moved him to the cot in her back room after his men had finally stopped hovering, convinced that their boss would survive without their guns pointed at her head every 30 seconds. Now she was regretting sending them away. Ji-yeon thrashed on the narrow bed, his skin burning beneath her palm, sweat soaking through the thin sheet. His eyes moved rapidly beneath closed lids, and his breathing came in short, desperate gasps. Lauren had seen fever dreams before, but this was different. This was terror. "Ji-yeon," she murmured, reaching to press a cool cloth against his forehead. His hand shot up and locked around her throat. The world narrowed to the pressure of his fingers, cutting off her air with the mechanical efficiency of someone who'd done this before. Many times before. Lauren's survival instincts screamed at her to fight, to claw, to break his grip, but something deeper made her freeze. His eyes were still closed. He wasn't seeing her. He was seeing something else. Something that made his face contort with the kind of rage that came from helplessness. She couldn't breathe, but she could hum. The melody came from somewhere in her childhood, an old R&B song her grandmother used to play on Sunday mornings. It vibrated in her chest, soundless but present, and she let it fill the space between his nightmare and reality. Her hands moved to his wrist, not pulling, just touching, gentle, present. "It's just a dream, Ji-yeon," she managed, the words barely a whisper against his grip. "You're safe." His eyes snapped open. For one terrible second, Lauren saw the void behind them, the place where Kang Ji-yeon had learned to survive by becoming something that didn't feel, didn't hesitate, didn't stop until the threat was eliminated. Then recognition flooded in, and horror followed. His fingers released her throat like she'd burned him, and he jerked backward so hard he nearly fell off the cot. The word died in his throat. He stared at his hands like they belonged to someone else, then at the red marks blooming on her neck. His face went white beneath the fever flush. Lauren rubbed her throat, coughing once, then met his eyes. She didn't look afraid. She looked concerned. "For him, bad dream?" she asked, her voice rough but steady. Ji-yeon couldn't speak. His chest was heaving, his heart hammering against his ribs hard enough to hurt. He'd almost killed her. Would have killed her if she hadn't somehow pulled him back from whatever dark place the fever had dragged him into. The orphanage. He'd been back in the orphanage, fighting over a bowl of rice with boys twice his size, learning that mercy was just another word for weakness. Ji-yeon. Lauren shifted closer, and every nerve in his body screamed at him to move away. "You're burning up. Let me." "Don't." The command came out harsher than he intended, but she ignored it. Reaching for the cloth she'd dropped, she pressed it against his forehead, and the coolness made him shudder. Or maybe it was her proximity. She was too close. Close enough that he could smell cocoa butter mixing with antiseptic. Close enough to see the pulse beating in her throat where his fingers had been. She should be running. Should be calling his men to drag him out. Should be doing anything except taking care of him like he deserved gentleness. "You're safe here," she said again, and the words hit him like a physical blow. Safe. When had he ever been safe? Safety was a myth sold to children who hadn't learned yet that the world was built on violence and the strong devoured the weak. But here, in this small room with rain pounding outside and Lauren's steady hands cooling his fever, Ji-yeon felt something crack open inside his chest. Something he'd buried so deep he'd forgotten it existed. Want. Not the cold calculation of desire he'd felt for other women. Not the transactional exchange of pleasure and power. This was different. This was hunger raw and desperate and terrifying in its intensity. He wanted to pull her close and feel her heartbeat against his. Wanted to trace the curve of her mouth and learn what made her laugh instead of just commanding respect through fear. Wanted to bury his face in her neck and breathe her in until the smell of gunpowder and blood was replaced by something softer. He wanted to devour her. And the wanting felt more dangerous than any bullet. "Get away from me," he said, pushing himself up despite the way the room spun. Lauren didn't move. "You need rest. The fever." "I said get away." He swung his legs off the cot, ignoring the pull of stitches and the weakness in his limbs. "I'm leaving. Like hell you are." Her hand caught his shoulder, firm and unyielding. "You can barely stand." Ji-yeon looked at where her fingers pressed against his bare skin, and something in him snapped. He grabbed her wrist, not hurting, just holding, and pulled her close enough that their faces were inches apart. Close enough to see her pupils dilate, to feel her breath hitch, to know with absolute certainty that she felt it too. This thing between them that had nothing to do with gratitude, and everything to do with the terrible recognition that they were both people who'd learned to survive by never letting anyone close enough to wound them. "You don't know what I am," he said, his voice dropping to something raw and unguarded. "What I've done. What I'm capable of." Lauren's free hand came up to cup his jaw, and the tenderness of the gesture nearly destroyed him. "I know exactly what you are, Ji-yeon, and I'm still here." The rain pounded harder, the fever burned, and for the first time in his life, Kang Ji-yeon was afraid of something that couldn't be solved with violence or money or cold calculation. He was afraid of the woman in front of him, and what it would mean if he let himself fall. He released her wrist and turned away, jaw locked, refusing to let her see how close he was to begging her to stay. Ji-yeon was helping Lauren inventory supplies when the windows exploded inward. The sound came first, a roar like the earth splitting open, then the pressure wave that turned air into a solid wall. Glass became shrapnel. The front of the laundromat simply ceased to exist, replaced by smoke and fire and the screaming of car alarms. Ji-yeon's body moved on instinct, tackling Lauren to the floor and covering her with his frame as the world disintegrated around them. He felt the heat of the blast scorch his back, heard metal twisting and concrete crumbling, and knew with absolute certainty that the Soul faction had found him. The shooting stopped as suddenly as it began. 30 seconds of hell, then silence broken only by the crackle of flames and the ringing in his ears. Ji-yeon pushed himself up, tasting blood and dust, his hands scrambling to find Lauren beneath him. She wasn't moving. Lauren. His voice sounded distant, muffled. He rolled off her, and his heart stopped. She lay motionless in the rubble, a thin trickle of blood running from her temple, her eyes closed, her chest utterly still. Dust covered her dark skin like ash, and for one terrible moment Ji-yeon thought he was looking at a corpse. Not just any corpse. Hers. The only person in 15 years who'd made him feel like something other than a monster. No. The word came out broken. He pressed his fingers to her throat, searching for a pulse, and found nothing. No, no, no. His medical training was limited to field triage and keeping people alive long enough to extract information, but he remembered the basics. Airway, breathing, circulation. He tilted her head back, checked her mouth for obstructions, and put his ear to her lips. Nothing. No breath. No flutter of life. Panic hit him like a drug, fast and vicious and overwhelming. The ghost, the man who'd executed dozens without flinching, who'd built an empire on calculated violence, shattered into pieces. His hands shook as he positioned them over her sternum and started compressions. 1, 2, 3, 4. He counted out loud, his voice cracking on the numbers. 30 compressions. Then he tilted her head back and breathed air into her lungs, tasting dust and copper. Nothing. Breathe, he snarled, starting compressions again. Harder this time. Desperate, he felt something crack under his palms, her rib. Probably, and the guilt was acid in his throat. But he didn't stop. Couldn't stop. Breathe, damn you. You don't get to leave. Not like this. Not because of me. 30 more compressions. Another breath. Her chest rose and fell with the air he forced into her, but it was mechanical. Empty. She still wasn't breathing on her own, and Ji-yeon realized with dawning horror that he was losing her, that all his power, all his money, all the fear he commanded, meant nothing when faced with the simple mathematics of death. Lauren, please. His voice broke completely. He was begging now. Something he'd sworn never to do again after childhood taught him that begging only made the beatings worse. Please don't do this. Don't leave me here. He started compressions again, and this time he wasn't counting. He was just pushing, again and again, trying to manually restart a heart that had decided to stop beating. His own heart was hammering so hard he thought it might burst, and his vision was blurring with something that might have been tears if he was still capable of crying. Then she gasped. The sound was wet and horrible and the most beautiful thing Ji-yeon had ever heard. Lauren's back arched as her lungs remembered how to work, dragging in air mixed with dust that made her choke and cough. Her eyes flew open, unfocused and wild, and Ji-yeon caught her shoulders as she tried to sit up too fast. Easy, he said, though his voice was shaking so badly the word barely made sense. Easy. You're okay. You're breathing. Just breathe. Lauren's hand found his chest, fingers clutching his shirt like an anchor, and she coughed again, the sound rattling in her lungs. Blood still trickled from the cut on her temple, and there would be bruising from the compressions. But she was alive. She was breathing. She was here. Ji-yeon pulled her against him, one hand cradling the back of her head, the other wrapped around her waist, holding her so tightly he was probably hurting her but unable to let go. She was shaking. Or maybe he was shaking. Or maybe they both were. Her face pressed into his neck, and he felt her breath against his skin, warm and real, and proof that the image burned into his retinas was a lie. But he'd seen it. Seen her dead. Seen what loving him would cost her. Ji-yeon, she whispered, her voice hoarse. He closed his eyes and memorized this moment. The weight of her in his arms, the smell of cocoa butter beneath the smoke, the way her heartbeat felt against his chest, strong and steady and alive. He memorized it because he knew with sudden, crushing certainty that this was the last time he'd let himself hold her. Sirens wailed in the distance. His lieutenant would arrive soon with cleanup crews and explanations. The Soul faction had just declared war, and war meant bodies. It meant retaliation. It meant everyone close to him became a target, and Lauren had just proven exactly how vulnerable she was. He'd almost lost her. Next time, and there would be a next time, he might not be fast enough. Might not be able to restart her heart. Might have to watch the light leave her eyes, knowing he was the reason it happened. "We need to get you out of here," he said, his voice flat and cold as he forced himself back into the armor he'd worn his entire life. The armor that kept him alive by keeping everyone else at a distance. Lauren pulled back enough to look at his face, and whatever she saw there made her go still. Ji-yeon. "The Soul faction knows you exist now. They'll come back." He stood, pulling her up with him, already calculating exit routes and safe houses. "I'm getting you out of the city. Out of Korea. Somewhere they can't find you. What are you talking about?" I'm talking about keeping you alive." The words came out harsher than he intended, but maybe that was better. Maybe if he was cruel enough, she'd hate him. Hating him would keep her safe. "This is my world, Lauren, and my world kills everything it touches." An hour later, Ji-yeon stood in the alley behind what remained of the clinic and became someone Lauren wouldn't recognize. The sirens had faded into the distance. His men had swept the area, secured the perimeter, and now waited by 3 black sedans with engines running. Lauren sat on the curb 15 feet away, a blanket wrapped around her shoulders, staring at nothing. Blood had dried on her temple. Dust still clung to her hair. She looked small in a way that made his chest physically hurt, and Ji-yeon knew that if he let himself feel that pain for even one more second, he'd break. So he stopped feeling. The ghost didn't feel. The ghost calculated. The ghost survived. He picked up the metal briefcase his lieutenant had brought unmarked, heavy with cash, and walked toward her. Each step felt like walking to his own execution, but his face remained blank. When he stopped in front of her, Lauren looked up, and the hope in her eyes nearly shattered his resolve. "There's $500,000 in here," he said, his voice flat and businesslike, enough to disappear. "There's also a passport, visa documentation for the United States, and contacts who will help you establish a new identity in Chicago." Lauren stood slowly, the blanket falling from her shoulders. "What are you talking about?" "I'm talking about the end of our arrangement." He held out the briefcase without meeting her eyes. "Take it and go." "Arrangement?" Her voice cracked on the word. "Ji-yeon, what?" "You were convenient," he said, and forced himself to look at her then. Forced himself to deliver the lie while staring into eyes that had seen him at his weakest and hadn't flinched. "A useful asset when I needed medical attention. But now you're a liability. The Soul faction knows about you because I was careless. I had to protect you, and that protection almost got me killed." The words landed like physical blows. He watched her absorb each one, watched understanding dawn, and then harden into something that looked like betrayal. Good. Let her hate him. Hatred would keep her sharp, keep her moving, keep her alive. "You're lying." But her voice wavered with uncertainty. "I'm a criminal, Dr. Wilson. Lying is what I do." He thrust the briefcase toward her, and when she didn't take it, he set it at her feet. "You saved my life, and I'm paying the debt. But the debt is paid now. We're done. Look at me." Lauren stepped closer, and Ji-yeon took a step back, maintaining distance because if she touched him right now, he'd collapse. "Look me in the eye and tell me the last 3 weeks meant nothing." He did. He looked straight into her warm brown eyes, the eyes that had watched over him during fever dreams, that had crinkled when she laughed at his dry observations about her American coffee addiction, that had darkened with something dangerous when he'd pulled her close in that storm-soaked room. He looked at her and lied with the same cold efficiency he used to sign death warrants. "They meant nothing. You were there, and I was bored. The injury made me weak. I'm not weak anymore." Lauren's hand trembled as she raised it, and for a moment Ji-yeon thought she might slap him the way she'd slapped his enforcer that first night. Instead, she reached for his wrist, her fingers wrapping around it gently. His pulse jumped beneath her touch, betraying him, and he saw her register it. Saw her feel the way his heart was racing despite the ice in his voice. "Your hand is shaking," she whispered. Ji-yeon pulled away like she'd burned him. Fear response. Adrenaline from the attack. Basic physiology, doctor. Don't read into it. His lieutenant appeared at his elbow, and Ji-yeon seized the interruption like a lifeline. "Get her in the car. Make sure she gets to Incheon Airport. First-class ticket to Chicago, departing in 3 hours. Stay with her until she boards." "Ji-yeon, please." Lauren's voice broke completely, and the sound of it was a blade between his ribs. "Go," he said, and this time his voice was pure command. The voice that made hardened criminals obey without question. "If you stay in this city, you die. Maybe not today, maybe not next week, but eventually. I don't have time to keep saving you." The lieutenant guided Lauren toward the car. She was too weak to resist, too shocked by the brutality of his dismissal to fight back. But at the car door, she stopped and turned back. Her eyes found his across the alley, and Ji-yeon felt every carefully constructed wall crack under the weight of her gaze. "You're a coward," she said, loud enough for him to hear. "Not angry, just factual. You're more afraid of losing me than I ever was of dying for you." The car door closed. The engine hummed, and Ji-yeon stood motionless as the vehicle pulled away, watching the taillights disappear around the corner and taking the only good thing he'd ever had with them. His second lieutenant approached cautiously. "Boss? Orders?" Ji-yeon turned, and the man actually flinched at whatever he saw in his face. The ghost was back, but this version was colder, sharper, more dangerous than before. This version had nothing left to lose. Find every member of the Soul faction, Ji-yeon said, his voice empty of everything except purpose. I want names, addresses, family connections. I want to know where their children go to school and where their wives buy groceries. Sir, burn them. The words came out quiet, which somehow made them more terrifying. Not just the soldiers. Everyone. I want the Soul faction erased from existence. I want their legacy to be a cautionary tale about what happens when you touch something that belongs to me. That will start a war. Good, Ji-yeon said, and walked toward his own car, leaving the lieutenant staring after him in shock. I could use the distraction. 5 years later, Kang Ji-yeon stood at the floor-to-ceiling windows of his penthouse and surveyed an empire built on ash. Seoul sprawled beneath him in a grid of lights. Every district, a territory he controlled. Every shadow, a place his influence reached. The Soul faction was gone, not just defeated but erased. Their legacy reduced to whispered warnings in back alleys. 3 rival syndicates had fallen in the years since, absorbed into his organization or destroyed trying to resist. He owned politicians, judges, police captains. His legitimate businesses generated enough revenue to buy small countries. Forbes would have listed him in their billionaire rankings if they knew he existed. He slept 2 hours a night. The insomnia had started 6 months after Lauren left, and never stopped. Ji-yeon had tried everything, prescription medications that made him groggy without granting rest, meditation techniques that only gave his mind more space to remember, even a brief experiment with drinking himself unconscious that ended when he realized he couldn't afford the vulnerability. So he worked instead. 18, 20, sometimes 22 hours a day, filling every moment with decisions and calculations and the endless maintenance of power. Anything to avoid the quiet. His phone buzzed with the 12th message of the night, a shipping manifest from Manila that needed approval, a territorial dispute in Busan requiring his judgment, another invitation to some charity gala he'd ignore. Ji-yeon handled each item with mechanical efficiency, his fingers moving across the screen while his mind drifted to the one place it always went when exhaustion made his walls crack. The safe. He shouldn't open it. He'd promised himself after the last time that he wouldn't torture himself again this month. But it was 3 in the morning and the city was finally quiet, and the penthouse felt too big, too empty, too much like the cell he'd built for himself. His feet carried him to the study before he could talk himself out of it. The safe was hidden behind a panel in the wall, biometric lock keyed to his thumbprint alone. It didn't contain emergency cash or blackmail material or any of the practical secrets a man in his position should keep secure. When the steel door swung open, the only things inside were photographs and a single worn die. Ji-yeon pulled out the first photo with hands that weren't quite steady. Lauren at O'Hare Airport, exhausted and shell-shocked, her carry-on bag clutched like a shield. He'd had someone follow her from Incheon, making sure she boarded safely, making sure no one from his world tracked her across the ocean. The photographer had caught her in profile, and Ji-yeon could still see the bruise on her temple from the blast that had nearly killed her. The next photo showed her 3 months later. She'd found an apartment in Chicago's South Loop, nothing fancy but clean and safe in a building with decent security. The surveillance had been expensive and difficult to maintain without her knowledge, but Ji-yeon had made it clear to his American contacts that her safety was non-negotiable. Anyone who approached her with ill intent would disappear before they got within 10 feet. More photos. Lauren at a hospital, wearing scrubs again, her medical license somehow restored through channels Ji-yeon had paid obscene amounts to access. Lauren at a coffee shop, laughing with colleagues, the tension finally leaving her shoulders. Lauren at her medical school graduation ceremony 2 years later, her smile bright and genuine as she accepted some kind of humanitarian award. He'd watched her rebuild herself from thousands of miles away, a ghost haunting the edges of her new life. The irony wasn't lost on him. He'd sent her away to keep her safe from his world, then spent 5 years making sure that world's resources protected her anyway. Anonymous donations to her clinic. Strategic interventions when hospital politics threatened her position. A carefully orchestrated financial cushion she'd never know existed, ensuring she never had to choose between her principles and survival. It was pathological. He knew that. But knowing didn't stop him from opening the safe every few weeks to study these stolen moments of a life he'd chosen not to be part of. The most recent photo made his chest constrict. Lauren at some kind of medical conference, her natural curls styled in an elegant updo, wearing a dress that looked professional but still managed to make his mouth go dry. She was talking to someone off camera, her hands animated, her expression passionate. She looked happy. She looked like she'd moved on. She looked nothing like the woman who'd whispered coward at him in an alley 5 years ago. Ji-yeon traced the edge of the photograph with his thumb, careful not to smudge it. His investigator's most recent report sat beneath the photos, places she'd been, people she'd met, routine updates that felt more like punishment than information. There was a man mentioned in the latest file, a colleague from the hospital, someone who'd taken her to dinner twice. The investigator had noted it as potentially significant. Ji-yeon had read that line 17 times before filing the report away and pretending it didn't make him want to burn Chicago to the ground. He picked up the die last. His die, the one he'd lost in her clinic the night his world changed. She must have found it, kept it, maybe thought about him when she held it. Or maybe she'd thrown it away years ago and this was just another dice that looked similar. And Ji-yeon was so desperate for connection that he'd built an entire mythology around a piece of plastic. The penthouse was silent except for the hum of climate control and the distant sound of traffic 40 floors below. Ji-yeon stood there holding evidence of his obsession, the physical proof that he'd never let her go despite sending her away. The ghost of Busan, feared by every criminal organization in Asia, reduced to a lovesick fool who collected photographs like prayers. He deserved this misery, had earned it when he lied to her face and watched her drive away. Some men built empires to fill voids. Ji-yeon had built his to have something large enough to contain the emptiness Lauren left behind. His phone buzzed again. Another message. Another crisis requiring his attention. Ji-yeon put the photos back carefully, locked the safe, and returned to his desk. The work would continue. The empire would grow. And somewhere in Chicago, Lauren Wilson would keep living the life he'd made sure she could have. It was enough. It had to be enough, even if it felt like dying slowly, one sleepless night at a time. The Paradise Hotel ballroom was a carefully orchestrated lie, and Ji-yeon was drunk enough to see through it. 3 syndicate families gathered under the pretense of a charity gala, all smiles and handshakes while their bodyguards watched each other with the tension of wolves circling the same kill. The truce negotiations had taken 6 months to arrange, and Ji-yeon had spent the last hour nursing whiskey and pretending to care about territorial agreements when all he wanted was to be back in his penthouse, alone with his insomnia and self-inflicted punishment. He'd stopped counting drinks after the 4th, maybe 5th. His lieutenant kept shooting him concerned looks, but Ji-yeon ignored them. He could hold his liquor, and more importantly, he could hold his mask. 5 years of practice had made him an expert at appearing functional while slowly disintegrating inside. Then the announcer's voice cut through the ambient noise. Dr. Lauren Wilson, representing the International Medical Relief Foundation. Ji-yeon's glass stopped halfway to his mouth. The ballroom doors opened, and she walked through them like she'd been born to command attention. The dress was gold, liquid metal that caught every light and made her dark skin glow like she'd been touched by something divine. Her natural curls were styled in an elegant crown, and she moved with the kind of confidence that came from surviving hell and deciding to thrive anyway. She looked nothing like the frightened woman he'd shoved into a car 5 years ago. She looked like a queen surveying a room full of peasants. She looked untouchable. Ji-yeon's hand tightened around his glass hard enough to hurt. Every nerve in his body screamed at him to move. To cross that ballroom floor and what? Apologize? Beg? Fall to his knees and confess that he'd spent 5 years in a prison of his own making because the thought of her getting hurt again was worse than any torture he'd ever endured? Then he saw the man, tall, American, wearing a suit that screamed old money and easy privilege. He appeared at Lauren's side with the casual familiarity of someone who'd been there before, and his fucking hand settled on the small of her back like he had the right. He leaned in, whispered something in her ear, and Lauren laughed. Not a polite laugh, a real one. The kind that made her eyes crinkle and her whole face light up. Something inside Ji-yeon snapped. The glass shattered in his grip. He didn't feel the cut, didn't register the blood dripping onto his shoes. All he could see was that hand on her back, that mouth too close to her ear, that easy intimacy that should have belonged to him, mine, something primal and possessive snarled in his chest. She's mine. The rational part of his brain tried to intervene. He had no claim to her. He'd sent her away. He'd chosen this. But rationality was drowning in a flood of jealousy so toxic it tasted like poison on his tongue. 5 years of watching from a distance, of protecting her through proxies, of convincing himself that her happiness was enough, all of it evaporated in the face of another man touching her. Ji-yeon started walking. His lieutenant grabbed his arm. "Boss, don't..." He shook him off without looking, his gaze locked on Lauren and the man who thought he had the right to stand that close to her. The crowd parted instinctively, sensing danger the way prey animals sensed predators. Conversations died in his wake. Ji-yeon didn't care. His entire world had narrowed to the woman in gold and the unacceptable reality of someone else making her smile. He was 10 feet away when the man's hand slid lower, settling at Lauren's waist. Proprietary. Comfortable. like he'd done it 100 times before. The jealousy turned volcanic, and Ji-yeon felt his control, the famous ice-cold control that had built an empire, begin to fracture. He could kill this man, would kill him. Snap his neck right here in the ballroom and deal with the political fallout later, because nothing was worth watching another man touch what belonged to. Lauren's eyes found his. The impact stopped him mid-step. For one suspended moment, the entire ballroom faded away, and it was just the two of them, locked in a stare that carried 5 years of unsaid things. Ji-yeon watched shock flicker across her face, then something harder, recognition, understanding, and beneath it all, something that looked like barely controlled fury. She didn't look away, didn't flinch, just held his gaze with the same unwavering strength she'd shown that first night when she'd slapped his enforcer and demanded respect. But there was something new in her expression now, a challenge, like she knew exactly what seeing her with another man would do to him, and she wanted him to feel it. The American said something, oblivious to the storm brewing 5 feet away. His hand moved again, and Ji-yeon felt murder settle into his bones like an old friend. He took another step forward, and he absolutely knew that he was about to do something unforgivable. That he was about to become the monster Lauren had always deserved better than. That 5 years of distance and protection and self-imposed exile were about to be destroyed because he couldn't stomach watching someone else hold her. Then a small figure stepped out from behind Lauren's skirt. A boy, 4 years old, maybe 5, dressed in a miniature suit that was almost comical in its formality. He looked up at Ji-yeon with dark eyes that were achingly, impossibly familiar, and reached into his pocket with a child's unselfconscious movement. 2 dice appeared in his small hand. Click-clack, click-clack. The sound cut through Ji-yeon's jealous rage like a blade through silk. His breath stopped. His heart stopped. The entire world stopped as he watched this child, this boy who had his eyes, his posture, his nervous habit roll dice over tiny knuckles with the practiced ease of someone who'd been doing it for years. The boy looked up at him and smiled. Not the innocent smile of a stranger. Something deeper. Something that looked like recognition. And Ji-yeon realized with crushing, devastating clarity that he'd been watching the wrong person for 5 years. The ballroom held its breath as Ji-yeon closed the distance, and even the music seemed to die in his wake. 5 feet. That's all that separated him from Lauren and the man whose hand still rested on her waist like a brand of ownership. Ji-yeon's presence had always commanded attention, but tonight it was different. Tonight he radiated something darker, more dangerous. The kind of energy that made survival instincts scream warnings. Conversations around them stuttered and stopped. People shifted away without knowing why, creating a widening circle of empty space. Lauren turned fully to face him, and Ji-yeon saw the exact moment she registered what he was about to do. Her eyes widened not with fear for herself but recognition of the violence coiling in his muscles. She moved with decisive speed, stepping directly in front of the American, placing her body between him and Ji-yeon like a human shield. "Don't," she said quietly, and the single word carried years of accumulated hurt. Ji-yeon's hands flexed at his sides. Blood still dripped from his palm where the glass had cut him, but the pain was distant, irrelevant compared to the roaring in his ears. He could see the American's confused face over Lauren's shoulder, could calculate exactly how many seconds it would take to reach around her, and movement at the edge of his vision made him pause. A small figure emerged from behind Lauren's skirt. The boy from earlier, the one Ji-yeon had dismissed as some colleague's child, or a young relative. But now, standing in the space between them, Ji-yeon could see details that made his world tilt sideways. The child's face was a blend of features, Lauren's full mouth and warm brown skin, but the bone structure was sharper, more angular. The eyes were dark, and assessing in a way no 4-year-olds should be. The boy wore a miniature black suit, perfectly tailored, and his posture was unnaturally straight for someone so young. He looked up at Ji-yeon with an expression that was curious but unafraid, and something about that fearlessness felt achingly familiar. Then the child reached into his pocket. Ji-yeon watched, frozen, as small fingers emerged holding 2 dice, worn at the edges. The same faded red color as the ones he'd carried for 20 years. The ones he'd lost in Lauren's clinic the night his life changed. The boy held them up like an offering, then began rolling them over his knuckles with practiced, nervous precision. Click-clack, click-clack. The sound hit Ji-yeon like a physical blow, driving the air from his lungs. His vision tunneled until all he could see was this child performing his exact tick, the self-soothing habit he'd developed at 8 years old in an orphanage when touch meant violence, and the only safe thing to hold was a pair of dice that couldn't hurt him back. The rage evaporated. The jealousy dissolved. Everything dissolved except the terrible, dawning understanding spreading through his chest like ice water. His name is Min Jae, Lauren said, her voice steady despite the tremor Ji-yeon could see in her hands. He's 4 years old, and before you ask, yes, Ji-yeon couldn't speak, couldn't move, could barely breathe. The boy Min Jae continued rolling the dice with single-minded focus, the movement exactly mirroring the nervous energy Ji-yeon used to expel when the world felt too big and too hostile. He found them in your jacket pocket, Lauren continued, and her tone carried layers of emotion. Ji-yeon couldn't begin to parse. The night you left. I was going to throw them away, but he. She paused, and when she spoke again, her voice was softer. He started carrying them everywhere. Said they made him feel brave. Ji-yeon's knees felt unstable. 4 years old. He did the math automatically, helplessly. 5 years since he'd sent her away. 9 months of pregnancy. That meant, you were already pregnant, he said, and the words came out broken. When I put you in that car, 8 weeks. Lauren's composure cracked slightly. I didn't know yet. Didn't find out until I was in Chicago, and by then. She gestured at the space between them, at the 5 years of silence and distance. By then you'd made your choice very clear. The American finally found his voice. Lauren, what's going on? Who is this? She didn't look away from Ji-yeon. Someone I used to know. Someone who decided I wasn't worth the risk. The accusation landed like a knife between his ribs, but Ji-yeon barely felt it. His entire focus had narrowed to the child standing in front of him, this impossible mixture of him and Lauren that shouldn't exist, but did. Min Jae had stopped rolling the dice and was watching the adults with an expression that was far too knowing. Are you my appa? The boy asked in Korean, his small voice cutting through the tension. The question shattered something fundamental in Ji-yeon's chest. He dropped to his knees without conscious decision, bringing himself to the child's eye level. Up close, the resemblance was devastating. This wasn't just similar features. This was his face, softened by Lauren's genetics but unmistakably his. The same intensity, the same way of tilting his head when analyzing a situation. Ji-yeon's voice failed him. He'd commanded rooms full of dangerous men without hesitation, but he couldn't finish a sentence in front of this 4-year-old who carried his DNA and Lauren's courage. Min Jae stepped forward with the fearlessness only children possessed and held out one of the dice. For you, he said simply. Ioma says you gave them to her, but I think you need one back. Ji-yeon's hand trembled as he reached out, and when his fingers closed around the small plastic cube, 5 years of carefully constructed emotional armor crumbled to dust. He'd spent half a decade convincing himself that sending Lauren away had been the right choice, the noble choice, the only way to keep her safe. But she hadn't just survived without him. She'd created life, had carried and raised his son alone while he wallowed in self-imposed misery an ocean away, watching through photographs and thinking his suffering was sacrifice. He looked up at Lauren, and she was crying silently, tears tracking down her cheeks while her expression remained fierce and unforgiving. You said I was a liability, she whispered. But I gave you a legacy, Ji-yeon. I gave you him. The devil of Busan knelt in the center of the Paradise Hotel ballroom, and the world stopped pretending it wasn't watching. Ji-yeon was dimly aware of the crowd, of the shocked whispers rippling through 3 syndicate families who'd just witnessed their most feared rival brought to his knees by a 4-year-old boy. His lieutenant stood frozen at the edge of the circle, hand hovering near his weapon but uncertain what threat he was supposed to neutralize. The American had backed away, finally reading the room correctly. None of it mattered. The only thing that existed was Min Jae's small hand extended toward him, offering a die like it was the most valuable thing in the world. Ji-yeon took it. His larger hand engulfed his son's completely, and the contact sent a shockwave through his entire system. Warm, real, alive. This child was alive because Lauren had been strong enough to survive what Ji-yeon had put her through, had been brave enough to build a life when he'd tried to pay her off like a debt to be cleared. Thank you, he managed, his voice rough as broken glass. Min Jae nodded solemnly, then did something that shattered Ji-yeon completely. The boy stepped forward and wrapped his small arms around Ji-yeon's neck in an embrace that was trusting and uncomplicated, and everything Ji-yeon didn't deserve. He smelled like children's shampoo and something sweet, and Ji-yeon's arms came up instinctively to hold him, terrified of his own strength, terrified of breaking this precious thing he'd had no idea existed. You're crying, Appa, Min Jae whispered against his shoulder. Ji-yeon hadn't realized. Hadn't felt the tears tracking down his face because his entire body had gone numb with the weight of what he'd almost lost. What he'd already lost. 5 years of his son's life. First steps. First words. Every milestone that Lauren had navigated alone. because Ji-yeon had been too much of a coward to fight for them. He looked up at Lauren over Min-jae's shoulder, and she was watching him with an expression that cycled between fury and grief, and something that might have been the last remnants of hope. Her hands were clenched at her sides, and Ji-yeon could see her trembling with the effort of holding herself together. "You sent us away to keep us safe," she said, her voice carrying across the silent ballroom. "So tell me, Ji-yeon, are we safe now?" It was a test, a challenge, an ultimatum wrapped in a simple question. Ji-yeon could feel every eye in the room on him, could sense his carefully constructed reputation hanging by a thread. The ghost didn't kneel. The ghost didn't cry. The ghost certainly didn't show weakness in front of enemies and allies alike, but the ghost had been a lie, a convenient mask for a man too afraid to be human. "I burned the city down so you could walk back into it," Ji-yeon said, and his voice was iron wrapped in gravel. He stood slowly, lifting Min-jae with him, settling his son against his hip like the weight belonged there. "The Soul faction is gone. The families who might have threatened you are either allied with me or eliminated. I've spent 5 years turning this country into a fortress with you at the center, even when you didn't know it." Lauren's breath hitched. "Ji-yeon, I'm not asking for forgiveness," he continued, taking a step toward her. "I don't deserve it. I lied to you, sent you away when you needed me most. Let you raise our son alone because I was too afraid of my own capacity to destroy things." He stopped directly in front of her, close enough to see the tears clinging to her lashes. "But I'm done being afraid. No one will ever touch you again. No one will threaten him. I'll burn the whole world to ash before I let anyone hurt my family." The possessive claim hung in the air between them. Lauren's eyes searched his face, looking for the lie, the manipulation, the cold calculation that had defined their last conversation 5 years ago. But Ji-yeon let her see everything, the grief, the regret, the desperate love he'd been running from since the moment she'd walked into his life and made him feel human. "Your family," she repeated, and her voice broke on the words. "If you'll have me," Ji-yeon extended his free hand, palm up, an offering. "I know I don't deserve a second chance, but he does. Min-jae deserves a father who'll protect him, who'll teach him to be strong without being cruel, who'll show him that the dice aren't about luck, they're about making hard choices and living with the consequences." Lauren stared at his outstretched hand for what felt like an eternity. The ballroom held its collective breath. Even Min-jae had gone still, sensing the weight of this moment. Then, slowly, Lauren placed her hand in his, and Ji-yeon felt the touch all the way to his bones. "One chance," she said fiercely. "You get one chance to prove you mean it, that you're not going to disappear the next time things get difficult. One chance is all I need." Ji-yeon shifted Min-jae to his other arm and laced his fingers through Lauren's, holding on like she was the only thing keeping him anchored to earth. Then he turned toward the ballroom exit, and his lieutenant snapped into action, bodyguards materializing to flank them on both sides. The crowd parted automatically, and Ji-yeon walked through them with his son on his hip and Lauren's hand in his, no longer the ghost but something more dangerous. A man with something to lose. A man with something worth protecting. "Where are we going?" Lauren asked as they reached the doors. Ji-yeon looked down at her, and for the first time in 5 years, he let himself smile. Really smile. Not the cold curve he used to intimidate enemies. "Home," he said simply. "We're going home." The ballroom doors closed behind them, and whatever came next, the negotiations, the power plays, the inevitable challenges to his authority, none of it mattered, because Ji-yeon finally understood what his empire had been missing all along, a reason to exist beyond survival. If this story wrecked you the way it wrecked me, do me a favor, hit that like button, drop a comment telling me which moment broke you the most, and subscribe because trust me, there are more stories like this coming. Stories about broken people finding their way back to each other, about love that survives despite the odds.